how many of you have felt anxiety and fear and don't know where it comes from? Yeah? Yeah. I think if you speak to most people, they will put their hand up. Say, yes, I've experienced that.
Yeah, that's when it came to my mind. I've got a daughter and she's had pretty bad problems, starting from when she was just a few months old. And I'm wondering, if I have this clearing, would she need a separate clearing, or would my clearing also affect her?
Well, good question. It works both ways. So by clearing you, we can help to clear her. But if it is a severe case or long-standing situation, then we would normally suggest that she had a session too.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. But certainly people do feel the difference. I know that people have had interactions with others and having issues with family or particular people and things like this, and we've done work with them. They've said that the change in the interaction has been phenomenal, that they wouldn't have believed it. But, you know, a softer approach, more accepting of each other, all of these things going on. So it works in a varied areas. It's expansive in what we do, and it does affect those that are, or you know, in your generation. It will help them as well. Yeah. So we've made it so that whoever is involved is helped, you know, with the absorption and the inheritance, because it clears out. And we actually clear 7 generations into the future too. Yeah. So it means those people coming in won't have to take that on board. Yeah. You know, because as we said, it can jump generations. So we want to be clear that doesn't come in later down the road. You know.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, so it's like no other therapy. I mean, it is a combination of techniques that work in a very different way than what we're used to. You know, so it's pushing the barriers to the bigger picture of what's happening here, and it's like what we're talking about today. You know, we've got things that we don't even realise and recognise that we hold, and don't recognise that we don't have to live it, because nobody's ever presented that before. We don't.
No.
So there's hope. There's hope and liberation for all. Yeah. Yeah. Right. We'll have a look at a little bit of the science and research that's coming out now, which I think you'll find really, really interesting. And a lot of this has gone on around Holocaust and war levels of experiences. And Israeli Professor Handes Weizmann has identified Holocaust survivors' traumatic experiences being passed down, and he calls this phenomenon intergenerational transmission of trauma. In other words, living in fear, threats of killing from war, survival, harsh living, grief and loss did not stop with the atrocities. They've moved on and living through generations to come. We pass on our disappointments, our expectations, our fears, anxieties, traumas, feelings of overwhelmed, or the level of weariness that we carry. And we will be destroying life rather than creating. So it suppresses, oppresses, and our expectations from life are reduced because we have a baseline of lack that we are inheriting, and we will live that level. So we are very much locked in to the emotional level of generational trauma that we haven't lived but continue to live. We haven't experienced it. We didn't create it, but we live it. And this is, it can be seen as very unjust, it's very shocking, and it's certainly sobering to know that we are living levels of depression and fears that aren't ours to live. As that man, that poor man, who my heart went out to him, that level of trauma, postnatal depression. He'd lived every day of his life. He hadn't known anything else in his life, ever. And that is tragic. It's beyond tragic. And to know that he'd lived those 30-odd lives without any relief. Everything he had tried to do for himself, everything that other people had tried to do for him, hadn't done anything, because it is a hormonal stimulus and a level of baseline living that has been inherited and is like a stick of rock. It's all the way through it. People very much work on the cognitive level, but memories are held all over the body. It's held in the cells, it's held in your energetics, held in your tissue, it's held in your bone. It's held everywhere, not just the mind. And from my perspective, we have to be working and looking at the bigger picture here for people, because if we don't, we're only doing part of the solution instead of the bigger picture and what people require to ditch this stuff that they didn't ask for. It's not pleasant to inherit, and will certainly make life very challenging and difficult for people. And we aren't even aware of it. We aren't even conscious of it. But when I talk to people and say to them, this is not yours, the relief of knowing I haven't created this is enormous for people. Because on a psychological level, they have got an answer as to why they're living what they're living. I don't know where it's come from. I haven't got the answers for it. And we find those answers. And the majority of it is from utero. I'm sorry to say, but that's the case. And now, of course, science is agreeing. Queen's University in Belfast have done their own trials because, as you know, in Belfast in Northern Ireland, they've had years and years and years of discord. And if you look at the bigger picture, they've had over 100 years of discord. And again, this level of depression and suppression, weariness, has now gone to a whole new level over there. And I started going to Ireland early 2000. And when I first flew in, it looked like a big black cloud over Belfast. And it wasn't the atmosphere. It was what was the negativity that was held in that place. Over the years, as the fighting has slowed down, I mean, still bits of it flaring up here and there now, but the changes, recently they said walls are coming down, which is really good news, that people are starting to accept each other's. Generations that have gone through this living of trauma through the Troubles has made its impact, and there has been great numbers of suicides in Northern Ireland. And with research, Queen's University found that it's one of the highest numbers in Europe. Nothing to be proud of. But they've done their research, and what they find, they are finding that it's biological. That people are inheriting this level of depression and weariness and devastation of living those times. And there are teenagers that are taking their own lives. Some of the times I've been there and hearing the recent popular news have been even children of 11 and 12 years old. Now that to me is a red flag of we are doing something seriously wrong here. Seriously wrong. Why are these children so psychologically overwhelmed and cannot live in life? What are we doing? We have to be doing something. And Queen's University have now recognised that when someone is traumatised, it will relate to others around them, including their children and grandchildren. And this phenomenon does not only lend itself to Ireland, but the world in general, and is suffering from the same outcomes, albeit being variable levels due to the living experience and their parental emotional inheritance. Something that I've advocated for a long time now and written a book about my finds. Although the research does not identify the depths that I'm talking about, they're still only looking at certain areas. Amazing, fantastic, and I'm really, really delighted that this is coming out. Because we really seriously need to deal with this in a big way and fast. Because our children are, even at the age of 5, are being diagnosed as being depressed. That is not normal by any stretch of the imagination. And we have vast numbers of mental health issues now. Depression, anxiety, not being able to cope, feeling overwhelmed. And it's the tip of the iceberg that we really need to deal with. And from my point of view, cognitive is not enough. I trained in stress management. I can talk to you all day about managing your stress. It's not going to do anything for your emotions, apart from increase them. Yeah? Trying to fit this into a box will not work. And for me, medication suppresses, and it just comes back to haunt somewhere else down the road, such as panic attacks, such as nervous breakdowns, and so on. Women that have had postnatal depression, we very often find that they go on to have panic attacks and hormonal stimulus and increases in depression, etc., later in life, especially around the menopause. You know, again, we come back to this hormone activation, menopause, adolescence, birth, pregnancy. Again, I advocate that when women are pregnant, very much we keep those memories of our own birth, of how traumatic that was for us. That will then create those hormonal stimulus when we're pregnant and also in our birth process. And we know now whole families that have just gone on and had C-section right the way through. Nobody's had a normal birth. And the birth process is there to activate different aspects internally for us, which is also the head, the mind. Also, it clears out all the fluids that we've absorbed from the amniotic fluid to get that out of our systems. And again, we've got lots of issues around children having asthma these days because of, I advocate shock, because that's where shock goes, but also wet lung syndrome, because they haven't gone through the birth canal. So again, are we really improving our situation here, or are we making it worse? And we really need to look at that. It is a personal choice, but if you don't have all the factors, how can you make a personal choice? That personal choice is only made on a small amount of information when we need the bigger picture. So I call this phenomenal sins of the fathers, the injuries of the memories being held within, and as a default for those not conceived is really scary to me. I don't know about you. It's really scary. A bomb waiting to go off psychologically and physically through no fault of those who follow on, but lived and received through the body cells and the DNA. And certainly it does give us a basis of understanding as why we are seeing mental health rise so rapidly today. From a dissolve and resolve point of view, it's a far bigger and greater picture than what we're looking at the moment. So in 2014, research from Emory University School of Medicine in Atlanta showed that it was possible for some information to be inherited biologically through chemical changes that occur in DNA. And during the test, they learned that mice can pass on learned information about traumatic or stressful experiences. The memory in this case was a fear of the smell of cherry blossom, aversions to subsequent generations. And according to the Broad Street Telegraph, from a transitional perspective, our results allow us to appreciate how the experience of a parent before even conceiving offspring markedly influence both structure and function in the nervous system of subsequent generations. So shocks received in the womb while forming are incredible. No bonding or receiving love, nurturing would create brain patterning and emotional core malfunction that would need investigating. For the individual or infant child, there would be little balance in life when they don't get this. Expectations unfulfilled, disappointment, frustrating at times, and overall underwhelmed. Life becomes an anticlimax. So I've seen adults in session who are very underwhelmed, and even a mix of both, overwhelming situations. And tests with new scanning technology on prisoners, psychopaths, and those with mental health issues over recent years have shown different brain patterning to those who recognize feelings and sensations. Finding prisoners, etc., would have a numbing and cold perception to life. Due to lack of recognition, spatial awareness, consequently frontal cortex and brain wired for numbing, living, and dysfunction. Neurologists are beginning to understand exactly how a baby's interaction with their mother determine how and indeed whether the brain grows in the way that it should. Professor Alan Shaw of UCLA, who has surveyed the scientific literature, has made significant contributions to it, and he stresses that the growth of the brain cells is a consequence of the infant's interaction with the main caregiver, usually the mother. And the growth of the baby's brain literally requires positive interaction between mother and infant, and the development of cerebral circuits depend upon it. He goes on to say that if a baby is not treated properly in the first 2 years of life, the genes for various aspects of brain function, including intelligence, cannot operate and may not even come into existence. Nurture and nature cannot be disentangled, and the genes a baby has will be profoundly affected by the way it is treated. The damage caused by neglect and other forms of abuse comes by degrees, and the more severe the neglect, the greater the damage. And the details how the chemical reactions that are essential to the formation of the new brain cells and connections between them are affected by the way the mother interacts with her baby are extremely technical. We now have a substantial body of evidence that shows that the way a baby is treated in the first 2 years of life determines whether or not the resulting adult has a fully functioning brain. And here we have 2 pictures, images of brain that were taken and published in 2012. The brains of 2 3-year-olds, children clearly showing the effects of neglect. You can see here that the brain is smaller, and the child on the right with the smaller brain will grow into an adult who is less intelligent, has less able to empathize with others, more likely to become addicted to drugs and involved in violent crime than the child on the left. The child on the right is much more likely to be unemployed and to be dependent on welfare and to develop mental and other serious health problems. The cycle of deprivation that continues across generations. 80% of brain cells that a person will ever have are manufactured during the first 2 years after birth. And if the process of building brain cells and connections between them goes wrong, the deficits are permanent. I don't tend to agree that it is permanent because I know we can make change, and I've had results from that. But what he is saying is right, that we do develop accordingly to what we receive. And we do have an innate level of need that we come into to be nurtured, to be loved. And if we don't have that, we create deprivation. And that cycle of deprivation will be passed down, because if the mother, the parents, the grandparents didn't experience that love and nurturing, they haven't got anything to pass on. And they pass on the deprivation rather than the love. Nobody's fault. But let's put things in place to stop it. Let's put things in place to correct it. Let's acknowledge what's going on. Let us use these science information. And what I'm advocating, that we don't have to live with this and we can change it. We know we can change it. I've seen it change. And people are living the benefits of it. So the way that the development of a child's brain is dependent on the way the mother treats the child and explains why this depressing cycle continues and happens. The frontal lobe contains most of the dopamine-sensitive neurons, and it's in the cerebral cortex. And dopamine, a hormone system, is associated with reward, short-term memory tasks, planning and motivation. And dopamine tends to limit and select. Sensory information arriving from the thalamus to the forebrain, and it will interpret your world accordingly. A report from the National Institute of Mental Health says a gene variant can reduce dopamine activity in the prefrontal cortex and is related to poorer performance and insufficient functioning of the brain region during working memory tasks and to slightly increased risk for schizophrenia. We know that children by the age of 3 hold anger patterns. They create this frustration and intolerance in certain areas. And again, it's passed down. Some of the things that you'll find in my book, Pregnancy and Birth, A New Generation. Recent discoveries concerning the role of biology in imitating behaviour were made in the 1990s when Rizzoli and his colleagues discovered a group of cells in the brain that they termed mirror neurons, where we absorb and copy what we are shown as children, as babies. And there's been lots and lots of trials about that. And these are areas that I teach about because these sort of things, the mirroring, is what is continuing things like abuse, intolerances to others. We mirror, we are shown, we copy, and dependent upon the development of which brain, the neocortex or the reptilian, is to whether you will continue those traits or not. If your parents drink, will you drink? If your parents smoke, will you smoke? If they took drugs, will you take drugs? Certainly, there are trials in my book that will tell you that there is a link of mother having drugs, even aspirin during pregnancy, will dictate a taste for medication and drugs in the fetus that then go on to have a default towards that. They will be more prone to take them. Again, with addiction to drink, same thing. It creates addictions within us. And then, of course, when we are born, we see that, we smell it, we take in that smoke, the alcohol. And again, with alcohol, fetal alcohol syndrome, again, there are trials and reports in my book that show, even while pregnant, having a glass of wine every night, because we don't have a small glass of wine anymore, it's a bucket of wine that we drink. And certainly trials that were done in Italy with groups of mothers that were, this was classed as a live trial. And they went to schools, tested children of their IQ, and then they went and spoke to mothers and families. What did you do while you were pregnant? And they found that a lot of these children had fecal alcohol syndrome, levels of lower IQ. And I can't say that the report was very kind to the parents, because, as they said, the culture of sitting around and having al fresco meals outside and so on, and drinking bottles of wine with a meal, which is classed as normal, was actually creating abnormal brain and cognitive behavior within children. And they said that this actual live trial was very, very surprising. And because of the live trial, they were able to see that this problem was far bigger than we appreciate with previous trials. So, you know, even if women give up alcohol once they find out they're pregnant, if they have been heavy drinkers, it will still be in their systems, and the baby will be formed from that. Same if they take drugs. And I must say that I have seen children, the result of that, from mothers who said, I gave up drinking as soon as I found out I was pregnant, but they binge drank. They binged taking drugs. And these children were a bit like preterm babies, where they were quite tiny. So, you know, it affects them in some way, shape or form. And these things we need to be aware of. So we're going to have a little look at attachment disorder, because we have such a lot of it now in our society and with children. And it's a broad term, intended to describe disorders of mood, behaviour and social relations. And it's arising from a failure to form normal attachments to primary givers early in childhood. The dominant theory used today in mental health and assessment and the study of infant and toddler behaviour. And this was termed in the 1960s to 70s, and it was applied to infants, toddlers and teens that were extended in the 1980s to include adults. And it was established from a research and development called Strange Situation Protocol that was put together by a psychologist, Mary Ainsworth, in the 60s and 70s and has continued to be used. Let me say that we spend millions and millions each year to deal with attachment disorders, with abusive, disoriented children and teens. We have very much regimented schools and places that these children go to. And let me say that from my observations, they're not getting very far with it. Not a lot is changing, because trying to make these children fit into a structure where they don't know what a structure is the first thing that they're going to have problems with. And the people who work in this environment are stressed beyond. They have a very, very challenging job. And they, living in that environment, working in that environment, is very, very challenging to keep good mental health. And I would say to a certain extent, you have to suppress any feelings that you would have been able to deal with these children to survive, basically, in this work. So we are spending an awful lot of money on this area of mental health, and we seem to be having more and more numbers of it and more issues. And of course, once it became teenagers, there is no support. The attachment disorder is still there and probably still taking medication for it, for them to fit into society, as they do with ADHD and ADD. But it doesn't change the scenario of what they are living. They're trying to manage it rather than deal with it, from my point of view. Attachment disorder, from my perspective, from a integrated, inherited generational trauma and absorption point of view, comes from birth trauma and separation, neglect and detachment, emotional deprivation, and handed around, so having no roots, no bonding in life. The numbness from birth, or frozen to cope with life, the birth experience, so it could be Von-2, it could be forceps delivery, it could be C-section, it could be preterm. But this is where they are separated from parents in the early hours, early living moments, hospitalized. Preterm children, certainly from my experience, associate the intervention with pain, and they have retreated back from that. So they associate touch with pain, because from an early age they've had lots of attachments put on them to help them to survive. Again, nobody's fault, but the level of deprivation has already started and will continue. The emotional deprivation here is rejected, abandoned, unloved, no bonding, chaotic, grief for the self and loss. Essentially, we don't know who we are. We have nobody that we can hold on to, nobody that can support us. We feel very isolated and alone in those first levels of living that don't decrease unless things change around them, to show them love, to get them to embrace and receive connection. Of course, those children that live in dysfunctional homes and dysfunctional families, neglect and detachment, and of course they will have inherited some of that dysfunction to start with. The neglect, unattended, can't cope, overwhelmed, ignored, abuse, domestic violence. The neglect of not caring, even down to not changing nappies, not cleaning them, not taking them out of the cot, putting them down in front of TV or the games, all of that sort of thing. It's a virtual living that they grow attachment to. It's not a healthy attachment, but they grow attachment to other things outside of themselves. And handed around, no roots. The child feels unsafe, fear, vulnerable, unable to form groups or bonding in life. And this could be foster homes. It could be mom goes out to work, so she passes it over into a nursery, into somebody else, a childminder, etc. And then when they get home, they get stuck in front of the TV and they're not able to have any connection with their parents, or very little connection with their parents. So again, they are looking outside of themselves, very much shut down, very much retreat. And they haven't been shown the rules of life, of how to survive in life. They've just been, here you are, plonked. You might as well be on an island. And these children, as they grow, become more and more chaotic, more and more retreating, more and more shutting down. So about attachment and separation anxiety will form. And it comes from separation from their caregivers. Terror, fear. Where have they gone? Are they coming back? You only know your mum. You don't know anybody else. How are you going to feel? Absolute terror. Emotional deprivation and being ignored, being left to cry, not cared for, and abandoned. And believe me, I've seen lots of clients that still hold that emotional deprivation. I was ignored. I'm not heard. Nobody sees me. And they're 52. They've lived that all their life. They could be 22. They could be 65. They haven't ever had anybody's respect. They haven't ever felt honoured in life. Because they, as far as they're concerned, they fade away into the wall. This may have come from being small within a home of domestic violence or abuse, where they don't want to be seen, because if they're seen, they will feel it in more ways than one. So compared to all psychological levels, emotionally, socially, behavioural development is classed as a higher risk in life. Certainly a drain on resources in social care, welfare. Space cadets, this is where they don't actually live in the body, they keep leaving because they can't cope with life. So they leave the body, they're ungrounded, they're not present. Illness, psychological issues, trauma, post-traumatic stress, postnatal depression for the mother, subsequent abuse, mental health disorder, abused or mistreated. Again, coming back, those memories of your own childhood when you start a family of your own. And this left unattended, the self-deprivation, unfed, not changed from a messy nappy, no attention, rejected, alone, lonely, unobserved, no stability, passed around from home or caregiver to another, even adoption. and the child feels anxiety, unsafe, vulnerable, disorientated, lives of survival. And many of these disorders can be linked with symptoms of ADHD. And certainly, speaking to people who foster care, they would relate to everything there with the children that they see. It's not small, this disorder. It's massive in our lives, and it's getting bigger and bigger with every year that goes by. So from my point of view, with the inherited generational trauma and absorption, no bonding, living from abandonment, rejection, lack of love, trauma and shock, essentially they are broken from an early age. They've been broken on every level. Post-traumatic shock symptoms will be evident and all-consuming, and developing trauma bonding symptoms to others of the same ilk that can be violent in nature. So they can go towards and feel drawn to others who are as dysfunctional as they are, because that's the only people they can relate to. They can identify something in them that is happening to themselves. Certainly, it's causing huge problem for society, as these children can't be educated. It's very challenging to educate them. As we realise with ADHD, we firefight with no solutions to correct. And as we've said, these children will grow into adults who are challenged to educate and integrate into society because they have no foundation to be able to do that. Costing billions yearly in healthcare, social services, welfare and education. And of course, the areas of dysfunction that go on from that, and passing on and creating the same. And the worst case scenario. Certainly from my experiences working with people with ADHD, children and adults, and looking at their history, the family may have had levels of depression, parents, grandparents, and so on, and even levels of ADHD that hadn't been identified in those times, but we would identify it now. And so, of course, if the parents are starting off with this formula, that formula then is carried on to the infant and so on, to greater degrees, depending upon their makeup. So the solutions. From a reality and dissolve and resolve emotions perspective, we have several problems to resolve. We cannot separate psychological and biological impacts from utero and formation, and what we pick up are conditioned to when life begins. Even from the first moments of life, we receive impacts and emotional fallout that can determine our life and brain cognition. Limits and capping come in all types of living packages, which are unique to each of us, and the dominance that you have received. So we need to educate to stop the suffering. The pregnancy and birth support we need to put in place, and we certainly need to look at trauma and shock that have been received during utero and the birth process, and correct those areas of lack of bonding. Certainly I've spoken to mothers who have had challenging births that have said to me, their words, I have been raped. I was not in control. There was intervention and I asked for no intervention and nobody listened to me. The trauma, the shock was enormous for the mother, and the mother would explain to me that she did not bond with her baby. And in some cases, mothers have said, that they didn't even feel anything for that child until they were 15 months old. Tragic. Very tragic for everybody concerned here, because the mother is still in that emotional status of feeling guilty, of feeling compromised, of not being in control of her birth process. And the emotional fallout from that has landed not only on her, but her baby too. And in that, they both suffer. And I could be speaking to that mother 5 years on from that pregnancy, 5 years on from that situation. She would still be holding those emotions. And what level of bonding would she have? We can go on to create that bonding, but is it the real 100% bonding, or is it a variation on that? Is it a level, a very small percentage of what we understand as bonding? Because if we didn't receive it, how do we know what the full-blown bonding feels like? We don't. I'm talking to her. Well, how were you with your mum? Oh, she was very cold. She didn't give me any hugs. And it just goes on and on. And these beautiful children, much wanted children, are suffering because of it and going on to have depression and anxiety. I wonder why. Some of these reasons are why that we can put right. So the emotional support that we need to support our women psychologically in pregnancy and birth, to educate and to prevent inheritance of generational trauma and absorption. Early years education and information. Preparing parents before they even go into pregnancy. The preparation is enormous to get your body right, to eradicate some of these weaknesses that you have and get rid of this stuff that you don't want to live anymore, creating your fears and anxiety, because you can. Because you can live without this. Birth intervention processes causing consequences and hidden psychological levels that are affecting bonding and nurturing that we can receive. Bonding needs all parties to participate. Now that's an epiphany in today's society. It doesn't just happen, especially when you have mothers and babies that are drugged up. It's a huge barrier to them feeling anything. And they might smile and they might hold that baby, but believe me, they will not know what way is up because of the shock that they feel. I've seen it in hospital wards. I've seen it when I've gone to visit my daughter who had her little one and went through her horrendous process. Horrendous. And Dad played his part and went immediately to the baby and held her and kept going back and picking her up and holding her and nurturing her. And yes, she was fractious at night because she didn't like being in the cot, because that cot was enormous to her. She was a tiny little preterm baby. And she didn't like being in that crib and that cot because it was so enormous, she felt unsafe. So she would cry. And Mum would put her here on her chest. And as soon as she went there, she would go to sleep. Well, 2 seconds flat. It's not a revelation. Common sense. Common sense that we seem to have lost. Common sense. Because we haven't been taught it. We don't know how to give it. But we can change that. So the cycle of deprivation can be changed. As I say, anecdotal evidence I have over the last 15 years have shown me that people can change. We can change the hormonal stimulus when we remove the emotional core. And we remove the emotional core, the hormonal stimulus changes. And it opens up new pathways of living, but also new brain pathways to formulate and work and be able to receive love and nurturing and compassion, to feel again. This level of deprivation I call dry ice, because it's as big as the Arctic and as solid as the Arctic in some people, because they cannot receive anything. It just bounces off them. I've had men that have come to see me in their 30s who really, really want a relationship. And their girlfriends have said, you have no feeling. You need to sort this out. And everybody around them are having families, they're having stable relationships, and they are not. And what happens is that they get to desperate areas of where they keep having these relationships, but nothing comes of it. They can have sex, but sex isn't love. It's what we think is love, but it's not. It's only, that is physical gratification. And yes, you can have very loving feelings within that, but that's not love. Love is more than sex. And these guys have come and they've told me their story, and they've travelled from all over the UK, even from Europe. And I'm here because my girlfriend said, there's something wrong with me and I need to sort it out. Sometimes it can go back to a loss early in life, to a grandparent, a parent, favourite animal that they had bonded with, and then it was taken away. And what do? They close down. And they say, I can't go through that again. I can't feel that pain again from that loss. And we've been able to work with them to remove that pain and suffering, that emotional core of loss and grief, which they hadn't dealt with. And once we did that, they could actually feel again. And I had one guy, he had a session on the Saturday, came back on the Sunday, and he travelled 6 hours to come and see me. And so he stayed overnight, came back the following morning, and he said, I've had some realizations overnight. How awful I have treated people. How awful I've been in my relationships. How unfeeling I've been, not able to recognize other people's needs. Because I was so cold and numb, I couldn't relate to anybody else. And turning these people around and allowing them to receive for the first time, sometimes in most of their life, is incredible. In my pregnancy and birth book, I have a story in there of a guy that came to see me in early 2000. And he was about 65, and he said, I want to feel love before I die. And you think, crikey, I want to feel love before I die. He was married, he had 2 sons, but he hadn't ever felt love. And we looked at his childhood. He was sent off to boarding school at the age of 6, 7 years old. He had elderly parents, and his mother didn't respond very well to the birth process. I don't know whether she had postnatal depression or whatever, but he had a wet nurse, as they did in those days. And he had a wet nurse, and he would see his parents at a certain time during the day, at tea, things like that, you know, Victorian values and all of that sort of thing. And he was sent off to boarding school at the age of 6. And I said to him, well, how did you interact with your parents? Well, when I went home, it was shaking hands with Daddy and shaking hands with Mummy. And this poor guy, he hadn't been shown any love or nurturing all of his life. And this man said to me, you know, I've even thought of going to see a lady of the streets to see if that experience would show me love. I said to him, how do you interact with your children? Do you give them hugs? Oh gosh, no. We shake hands. Oh, continuing the trait then. Yeah. And I worked with this man and helped to remove his absolute grief for himself. He was so lonely. He could have been on an island. This man, the trauma he held. And I know of other people that have been sent to boarding school, and they tell me, I'm emotionally inept. I can't interact with others. I don't know how to. They might have a family. They might have children. I don't know what to do. You know, we really need to start putting a line under this and moving on and stopping this level of deprivation that we continue. Nobody's fault because they don't know what they've done. I know that. But it doesn't have to go on, and we can put it right. With this, one of these men that I met, he had one of these new children who actually, it's very important for them to feel that love and nurturing. And it's very important that they interact with people who can receive and have an open heart. And his daughter used to blank him. Very hurtful as a parent to be blanked by your child. But she could see that he wasn't operating. As far as these kids are concerned, we're not operating at all. We're not online. And they're right, we're not online. We are offline. Because we're not feeling, we're not sensing. So we can change hormonal stimulus. We can change the cell's regeneration. And we can eradicate this. But we need education, and we need information, and we need awareness that can be helped. And we can do all of that. We can help to change the repetition and the status quo. We also dissolve the emotional patterns and biological inheritance that has been taken on board, because it's held everywhere. And believe me, we can save the NHS, welfare, and government, councils, social care, billions and billions, because this stops. It's not a plaster of maybe suppressing it, it stops it. So we can stop that cycle and circle for individuals, for families. It's fast, it's effective. What are we waiting for? So we can remove trauma and depression, post-traumatic stress, inherited absorption, plus much more. We can train you. We can send you to a practitioner so you can receive specialist practitioners that are trained in many aspects of integrated generation, trauma and absorption. Specialists in abuse, in women's health and trauma, birth trauma. They can also work with present day situations, psychological issues, and why we're stuck, why we're not moving on. Helping to remove those memories from the stores of the amygdala and the hippocampus that keeps you on this circle and cycle of hormonal stimulus, brain patterns, memories, emotions, behavior, and so it goes on and on and on. And we have two arms to the training. One of it is the light healing training. The other one is the practitioner's training, of where we can deal with present day situations, historical, generational issues, but also prevention. Let's prevent together to get rid of this. And Alunas stands for all, life, learning, oneness, nurturing, understanding, soul purpose and integration. And you can receive all of that in just 1 2-hour session. What are you waiting for? Let's move forward into our future with less absorption and inheritance of the wrong stuff, the old suffering Piscean age. We have to live this suffering consciousness from our children and our grandchildren and futures to come. We are pioneers in this, and you can be one of those pioneers and live life instead of existing. So join us, contact us, train, receive. All you have to do is turn up. Thank you for listening. My name is Joy Wisdom. I'm the founder of Alunas Zest of Life program, and I have many topics that I cover, and you can find those interviews on YouTube. I hope to meet some of you soon. Thank you.